Well, good morning or good afternoon or possibly the middle of the night, depending on where you are. I'm Mistress Rowan Perigrynne from the Kingdom of Lochac, and today I want to talk to you about purses of all different kinds in Spain from about the 13th to the 16th century. I'm going to be talking about the different types of purses, how they're constructed, and who wore what when, and some ideas on making your own. The way that I'm going to do this is I'm going to start with a slide deck where I'm going to talk through purses across time and talk about the different styles. And during that time, if you have any questions, feel free to put them in the chat. And when I get to the end of the slide deck, I'll stop and I'll check the chat and I'll make sure that we've covered all of the things that you've already asked. And then I've got some physical things to show you, and hopefully we'll have some room for discussion at the end too. So let's get started. Okay, I've already said this is what it is: Spanish purses and pouches. First, some terminology. There are a lot of words that are used for this: purse, pouch, bag, wallet, scrip, satchel. Heaps of different terms are used in English, and they don't all mean the same thing. When you're doing research in this area, they're all useful words to think about. And there's also a couple of other words that are used quite often on sites, both historical sites, museums and so on, but also other people who have done some research into this area. Spanish terms, likewise, there are lots of Spanish terms for purse, and the group at the top, all of those terms, bolsa is the general term for all kinds of purses, but there are many other types. The top group are all terms that were used in period for purses, but they again weren't very specific about what they meant. And of course, there are a couple of other modern terms as well. Armonier is a term that you'll often find on other websites, and it's become a bit of a term meaning a purse or a pouch. But in fact, it's a bit of a misnomer because it means an alms pouch, a charity purse, and very few of the examples that are used are actually that. But it's a useful term to know because quite often that's what people will tag things with. Purses vary by a number of different things. They vary by time, different styles in different times. They vary by country. Although there are some similarities, some types of purses are unique to some areas. They vary by gender. Men and women wear really quite different styles of purses most of the time. They vary by social class, not so much the type, but particularly the materials they're made out of, although you find that some types persist in the lower class when the upper class fashion has moved on. They also vary by function. So the purse that you use to hold small coins is not the one that you take on a journey. There are purses and pouches made of many different materials. You can see some examples here. We've got ones made of fabric, it's velvet. You've got knitted purses. You've got them made of leather, even made of woven straw. And they're decorated in many different ways. This one's heavily embroidered, and this one has metal mounts on the leather. They're also constructed in different ways, and there are several different examples here. Many of these are unframed purses. That means they're just made out of the fabric, just made out of the leather. But some of them have metal frames. So this one has a bar frame in it, and this one has a ring frame. And I'll be talking about those in a lot more detail. There are lots of different types, but I'm going to start with the basic. The basic kind of a purse is a money purse. It's a simple drawstring purse with no hanging strings, just two drawstrings, and it's used to hold money in many, many circumstances. You can see some examples here. There are purses of money in the chest, and he's holding one open. You can see the woman in the middle giving out alms. And you can see this one here, which is a lovely clear description showing the two drawstrings. This style of purse is used really across Europe, and it's the earliest style that we find examples of in art, and it was used throughout the entire period for holding coins, usually in another purse. There's another great way of finding examples of this in addition to people giving alms, and that is examples where you've got Judas at the Last Supper. He's pretty much always holding a coin purse of some sort with his 30 pieces of silver in it. You also find this style being used for a couple of other purposes. One is as a seal bag. This style was used around the base of a seal to protect it, attached to a document. And you'd find true reliquary bags, that is, small purses that hold a precious item, perhaps a relic. And these ones all have one thing in common. They have two drawstrings, they're small in size, and they don't have a hanging string, a separate hanging string. Now let's move on to women's purses. From the 13th century, we have the earliest images that I've been able to find. And if anybody has anything earlier, I'd love to see it. And we can see a number of examples here from different sources. And what we see is that in each case, we have a drawstring purse, like the ones we've just looked at, but now they're on long hanging strings, and they're hanging about the knee, maybe a little below, maybe a little bit above. You can see in this example, although the resolution is very poor, and again, I'd love a better example of this, that there's obviously some patterning indicated on that, and also some fringing along the bottom. Here's another example from the Book of Games, and you can see fringing along the bottom and some pattern, and you can see those long drawstrings, which indicate that it's a woman's purse. Here are some real examples. And again, you can see the fringes here, which are really typical of the 13th century, both for men and women. And you can see the long drawstrings. Even though these might be catalogued as reliquary pouches, they are probably personal pouches, purses that are worn by women, because if it's a reliquary pouch, you don't need the hanging string, it just gets in the way. You can also see the third one, which shows some pretty typical banding and design on it. How does that compare to what's going on in the rest of Europe? Well, if we look at some images in the central part of Europe, you can see this image of Berengaria of Navarre, and you can see that she is also wearing a drawstring purse hung on her belt. One of the things I want to point out to you is how small it is. There are, again, a lot of discussion about the fact that if the purse is really small, obviously it couldn't have been worn as a real purse because you couldn't put anything in it. Quite often what they were putting in it was only a small handful of money, and you don't need a very big purse for that. One thing that's different between Spain and the rest of Europe at this time is the form of decoration. In Spain, what we're seeing is really decorated textiles. We're seeing woven purses with geometric patterns on them and lots of fringes. Whereas in the rest of Europe, we're seeing things that are depicting images of people, and that's not something we're seeing in Spain. And quite often they've got 2, 3 bundles at the bottom, tassels or something. Again, not something we're seeing in Spain at this date. If we move into the 14th century, I have not been able to find a single image of a woman in the 14th century who's wearing a purse. So if you know of one, I'd love to see it. We have a few examples. There's a late 13th, early 14th century knitted silk version, which is very famous. There is also a textile version in Valencia, and there are a number of purses which are actually held in Switzerland, but the place where they're held identifies them as being Southern European. And you can see that there are very, very great similarities between the designs on these and with the designs of the images that we've just been seeing. The long fringes, the very geometric banded designs and so on. Meanwhile, in Central Europe, again, you're getting lots of figures and you're getting, you don't get fringe, you get little tassels. If we move into the 15th century, we begin to see a few more images, but they're often hard to see. Sometimes, like the one with the red circle, you can see that there's a pouch or a purse, but it's under the outer layer. So it's over the saya, but under the outer layer. But towards the end of that period, you do start to see them on, again, more clearly. Here we've got a woman and you can see her purse. And you can see it's also got a lot of keys attached to it. Quite often you see that usually associated with a woman of a lower class or a servant or a handmaiden. If we move into the 16th century, we see that same style of purse, but now we are starting to see the three blobs on the bottom, which has been around in Western Europe for a really long time. There are also some examples. This one also you can see has a key. It's also beautifully decorated. This one is interesting because it has little pouchlets on the outside, and there are several examples of that sort of thing at the beginning of the 16th century. If we move a bit later in the 16th century, well, we're still pretty early, you can see again some examples here. And they're very clearly being worn. These ones look like they're not made of textile, but that could just be because it's a sculpture and it's only painted fairly roughly. This one is interesting, and this is the style that starts to emerge from about 1520, which is, instead of being a flat pouch which is drawn up, it's a rounded pouch and it's drawn into a button at the base. And now we start to see lots of examples of that. And here is another one. And this one has pouchlets as well. And moving later in this century, in the 16th century, you can see a couple of images here of ladies from the Basque area and related places. And you can see that now typical style of the rounded purse with the button on the bottom and a couple of variations. This one here of the woman with the red purse on the right, which I found in a manuscript. She is a much lower class lady, and you can see that her purse is still the much simpler sort. The thing that we're not seeing is two things. One, we're not seeing any purses that are hung directly on the belt like men's purses. Women did not wear belt purses. We're also not seeing any purses with any kind of frame. So women were not wearing any purses with any kind of metal framework in it at all. And that is not only true for Spain, it's true for almost all of Europe. There is a little part of Germany and the Netherlands that have framed purses in a very small area. But through most of Europe and through Spain, what we're seeing are drawstring purses. Right at the end of the 16th century, there is another style, which is pockets. These are tie-on pockets. I have one picture which I found. I actually took this picture in the museum, and I'm really annoyed that you can't see the definition. I'll have to go back to Spain, clearly. But in that red circle, she is wearing a pocket. It's just, you can't see it. But there are a few examples of extant pockets. And there is some images from Italy where you can actually see how they're worn. So the ones that they've got in the museum don't have any tapes attached to them, but clearly they do have tapes attached to them and they're tied around the waist. And now we're going to move on to men's purses. Or maybe I'll stop at this point. Oh, I don't know if I can resume. I'll probably have to click through to the middle. Yeah, no. Let's stop at this point and just check if there are any questions.
So far, no questions in the chat. Does anybody have any that they would like to ask verbally now?
I did, actually. Yeah, I just find it interesting that the purses with keys on them were associated more with a lower class because, yeah, I've always seen anytime a woman has keys, it means she's head of a household, which is sort of a higher station. So I'm wondering, am I wrong on that, or am I just in the wrong period? What?
I think that is an assumption. I think that when you actually look at the specific images of women who have keys, they're never nobles. They are usually an attendant or an assistant. They may be the housekeeper for the house, but they're not the noble lady. So it's an interesting thing. We all have a lot of assumptions, and when I started researching purses about 30 years ago, I had a lot of assumptions, and I've learnt to try and set those aside when I'm looking at a new area. So that is what I have observed. Looking at the images that I have seen, the ones with the keys don't tend to be noble women.
Fascinating.
Okay, let's go back into it then.
Oh, hold on.
Sorry, Rowan, I had a question too. It's Mirinda.
And there's one was the purse knitted in silk? Yes, the purse was silk. And the examples that they've got are all of the textiles are silk textiles from the extant examples. Mind you, they're the ones you're going to keep, right? Sorry, somebody had one more question.
Yep, it's Mirinda. Rowan, a lot of the hanging purses I've seen done previously where the hanging part is threaded through with the drawstring, but obviously when you're wearing that doesn't work. So
it does not work, and it is one of the things that people do that is absolutely not borne out by the images in the artwork or by the extant examples. They always have a separate hanging string. It's a really important feature.
And how is that attached then? Is that on one side of the purse, or would that go around the whole perimeter of the purse?
It's attached at one edge. Well, it can be attached two ways. It's attached at one side of the top and comes in the other side of the top, or sometimes that extends all the way down. And I'll talk about the construction of that later. So right now,
thank you.
I'll get back into the slides and we'll get through the rest of those. And now I need to go down to, oh, we did that. This one. So now we're moving on to men's purses. You can see already by my little images that there are a lot more different types of men's purses. But again, they were not all worn the entire period. There were specific styles that were worn at different times. Like women in the 13th century, men wore drawstring purses. They're hard to spot, but there are a couple of great images in the cantigas where the man is being importuned or possibly being very happy to be selling what he's got or buying what they've got. And you can see these purses here. Again, that same images that we're seeing. We're seeing the rich textile. We're seeing the geometric banded pattern. We're seeing the fringing down the bottom. But you'll see that they're much, much higher up. So they're not worn on long strings. They're worn on very short strings right up on the body. And there's this great picture from the Book of Games where a man who looks like he has spent his clothes on cards, you can see his purse there on a short string attached to his breeches girdle. This image, I don't know if you can see this, but this image off to the side is really interesting. It's the only image of its type I found. It's in Burgos. It doesn't have a date on it, and it's either 13th or 14th century, but it's really interesting because it's got quite long purse strings. It's the only thing like that I've seen. So I put it there as a curiosity. But coming back to the men's purses, you can see how similar these are to the one in the Sion Museum. They're fringed down the bottom, they've got short hanging strings, and they've got 2 drawstrings, and they've got these fabulous graphics on them. Meanwhile, in Central Europe, we're seeing similar but not the same. They are much simpler, they don't have any fringing on the bottom, they're much, much more basic. But for men, again, we've still got that same thing of the basic drawstring pouch, 2 strings, short hanging strings. Moving into the 14th century, we begin to see unframed purses. I should say that I think that the drawstring purses continued through the 14th century. I don't have any evidence of that. I have a single image from the start of the 15th century worn by a workman. So I think it's likely that they continued, but I don't have any examples of that. What we do start to see are the other kind of purses, which are flat purses, simple belt purses. You can see this one here with a rounded base and is being worn with his sword through it, his dagger through it, which is very common all over Europe at this point. This example you can see moving into the 15th century is a very exaggerated, what we call a kidney purse. So it's got the 2 lobes at the bottom and it's got a belt around the middle of it. This is a rare example of this. This is not a common style in Spain. There are much, much more common styles. And it's important to remember that in this part of the 15th century, the first half of the 15th century, we're starting to get a lot of influence from the Netherlandish painters who are coming in. So that's a possible source of that. What we're not seeing is what I think of as the classic kidney pouch with the big, shiny, C-shaped metal mounts and lots of mounts on the purse and possibly double purses. That kind of style is all over Central Europe, including England, France, and Germany and the Netherlands, but it's not something we're seeing in Spain. So even though that is a medieval purse for a lot of people, that's not what we're seeing in Spain. This purse is a really interesting one because it's only seen in Spain. And this purse is what I'm calling a gusset belt purse. And it's worn very high on the belt. It's not hanging from the belt. It has loops at the back, which the belt passes through. So it's sitting right up on the belt. And they're often wide and not very deep. They sometimes have a belt around them, but not always. And this purse with a gusset in the side, I have only found in Spain. And I think that's just a fascinating thing. I haven't found it in any other country. You can see here's another example. This one is hung just immediately below the belt, but you can still see the gusset in the side. And then this, which is quite a famous picture, you can again see this is now getting larger. We're moving into the 16th century. It's getting larger, and I've found a couple of examples later in the 16th century which are even longer. This one doesn't have a belt over it. It has tassels. Spaniards love tassels. They are on so many of the pouches. The next style is what I'm calling the capped drawstring purse. So it's a drawstring purse, but it has a lid on it, a cap. You can see here there is a drawstring purse, but it's also got this lid on it, this cap, this flap with a buckle. This one has a cap, but this one's actually a very interesting one. It's actually a compound purse. And this one, where you can see that the top is buttoned in. Some of these examples you can see the drawstrings. Some of them you can't see the drawstring, but that's obviously the way that it's made because you can see the little gathers coming up in underneath, and that's how you get in. The big change next was moving to framed purses. So we've had purses only made out of textiles or leather, and now we're moving into ones where there's a metal frame involved. The most simple version of this is a ring purse. And you can see here that there's a ring which is holding the mouth of this purse open. It's then a leather purse attached to that. And this one has tools in it. You usually see these ones associated with workmen, and you can see the tools. I've got a 14th century example from Sweden. And you also see them associated with hunting, because the ring holds the bag over. They can kill the bird or the rabbit or whatever and then just stuff it in the pouch. So they're often known as hunting pouches, but they're seen, as you can see, in other examples. The next image along you can see is an upmarket version of this. So it's a simple ring with the bag underneath. It's open, but it's being worn by somebody in the upper classes. The later version of this has a lid on it, which is on another ring. So there's a ring that's holding the pouch open, and then there's another ring supporting the lid. And some of these could be very heavily decorated. We see these examples up to the middle of the 16th century, and then they just disappear from view in Spain. They persist in a couple of other countries, particularly England, but we don't seem to see them anymore. Another style is the bar purse. The bar purse is a very simple thing, and you can see here's an image of what the bar looks like. This is from the Museum of London collection. And you can see that there's a bar and there's a swivel in the middle with a loop, and that is what is attached to the belt. And the textile is then made up, or the leather is made up, and then this is holding it straight at the top. So you can see here, you can see very distinctly the bar there, which is holding it together. Now this still has a drawstring, a drawstring purse underneath it, but it's being held out by the bar. Here's another example, and this is a very upmarket example. You can see that we've got a highly decorated frame, bar frame, and a velvet textile and lots of gold embroidery. So they weren't just used at the bottom end of the scale, they were used across. I think this one is also a bar frame, because I can't see any other way of making that super rigid top and holding it up with the strap without the corners collapsing. There are quite a number of examples like that. The next step was to move from a simple bar to a D frame. So here, what we're doing is we're combining the bar, and then we're attaching a ring which swivels on the bar. And here's an example with the swivel bit turned down from the Museum of London. You can see there's a bar there, there's the swivel for attaching it and the loop for attaching it to the belt, and then there's one or sometimes two frames that are articulated onto the bar. And you can see that clearly here. You can see the bar and you can see the two frames that are underneath that. This is a later example. This particular one here is Italian, but you can still see that bar across the top and the frame. Now the frame has moved from being a simple D to being more of an O, but it's still articulated onto the bar. The next kind of purse, the final kind of complication, is what I call a double purse. And it's where there is more than one way of getting into the same purse. There are examples of these in Central Europe all the way through from the belt pouches, but there are some really interesting, clever designs with very, very complicated arrangements. So this one here, for example, you can see there's a bar, and you can see there's this articulated bit around here, but you can also see that this top bit is shoved into the bottom half of the purse. So there are, in fact, there's another support for the bottom underneath, and you can get into the purse more than one way. I think this example on the left is one of those two. The interior colour is different, and I suspect that what it is one of these, which is a hinged purse. And what you are seeing there is the hinge open, and you're seeing the inside of the lining. If you closed the hinge up, you would then have access to the outer purse with a simple open D system. It wasn't just about small stuff purses. People had to carry lots of other stuff. If you were going on a trip or you were going on pilgrimage or you were coming back from the shops, you needed to be able to carry more than you could fit in your purse. So Pilgrim Bags, one of the few things that has an identifiable Spanish name, Bolsa de Perigrynne. And we have a lot of different Pilgrim Bags, and they're pretty much the same style through the entire period. They're a shoulder bag. They're a rectangular bag usually, and they're worn on a strap on the shoulder, and they're usually worn diagonally over the body. They are often marked for a pilgrimage, so you can see these ones are marked with a cross, and a shell is also a really common form of decoration. You can see that there are other variations too. So these ones here in the 13th century have that typical 13th century fringe along the bottom. But they love that. Whereas the others are a bit simpler. Here are some more Pilgrim Bags in different sizes and shapes. This one is sort of trapezoidal, and it's got a triangular lid on it, flap on it, and it has 3 shells on it. This one is much more of a basic bag sort. This one is really interesting because when you zoom right in, you can see that it's made of leather and it's been beautifully decorated. Or perhaps it's textile and it's been embroidered. I suspect from the colour that it may be chamois leather, but I don't know. And yet more, they come in all shapes and sizes. This one's really interesting because it looks as if it's made from woven straw or possibly woven reed. And this one is a leather one which is attached to a separate strap. And you can again see the shell, and it's got a different closure method. So many different ways of closing these things. Another kind of bulk carrier is the shepherd's bag. This you see in the Cantigas as being an alternative to the pilgrim's bag as a way of travelling, carrying travelling gear. But after the 13th century, the images that I've found have only been for shepherds. So it's not perhaps something that is going to be generally useful. Most of them are built in the same way. So it's basically a tube, it has an open end, it has a big shoulder strap, it's closed at the other end, you can hold it open, and you can see that if you're a shepherd, you could pick up a small lamb and put it in there. There is another version which has 2 lots of straps and it's worn like a backpack, but I've only found one image of that. There are some other ways you can carry things too. Baskets, usually round. I haven't seen square baskets and I haven't seen oval baskets. So what I'm seeing is round baskets in various sizes, usually worn, usually carried to market. If you are a noble person, then your servant is carrying the basket. And you see quite a lot of examples. And quite often you can see precious things in them. So that typically in the presentation to the temple, because, you know, you're seeing a pair of doves or a bunch of little birds or something, and the guy on the left is carrying eggs, I think. The woman has bundled up her gear and put it on her head to carry, including a cloth bag at the top, which is just bundled up, tied off, possibly a drawstring bag. What we're not seeing is something that's really common in the rest of Europe, which is a market bag, which is a long sack with a slit running down the middle, which you see all over the place. We're not seeing any of that in Spain, which I think is really interesting. So my key points. To state the obvious, your purse should match the rest of your outfit. It should be the same time period. It should be the same country. It should be the same social class. It should be the same gender. It should match the rest of your outfit. Consider what you're going to put in your purse. What are you going to use it for? Is it going to hold your keys and your wallet? Does it need to hold your phone? Think about your needs, but also stay in proportion for the style and the time that you're doing. If you can, base your purse on extant examples, but they're so rare. So look to the period art, look to the art of the time that you're interested in. Don't base it on what other people wear or on what other people sell, because they probably haven't done as much research. Look yourself, see what you see. Quite often there'll be a range of purses that are suitable at the time, particularly for men. So think about what's the most appropriate for you, and also what do you have the capability to make. Can you source all the elements? Particularly the bar purses can be quite difficult to get the style of frame that you want. When you're making it, print out your relevant examples as big as you can. Don't try and develop this from something you're looking on your phone. It's just not big enough. Test out your pattern in cheap materials, but use materials that are similar in weight and flexibility so that you get the effect. And iterate your pattern until you're really happy with it, and then make it. And I want to say a big thank you to Stanzi, Mistress Constantia, for letting me go through her entire collection of photos in addition to my own. I got lots of good ones out of that. All right, now let's have a look what else is in here. The backpack, yes. Thank you for some additional baskets.
Indeed. And then kind of going through all of that, I actually do have a question myself. When we're seeing a bit more of the 16th century era in Spain, and we're actually getting into like the rapier dagger stuff, I know that traditionally on a belt it would be the purse, it would be the dagger, and it would be the sword, and those would be like the only three things that would be on a belt, and even at that point it would be rather busy. We know that the rapier and dagger in most cases were made as a matched pair. Would there ever be instances that the purse was either made as a companion to the other pieces, or were they like made like retroactively to match them as close as possible, or were those more done to match like the other fabric portions of the outfit?
Good question. And I'll answer it in two ways. One is that if an external purse was worn, it is most likely to have been made as a set with the hanger and the other things. They were considered to be more alike to each other than the clothing. So they were all worn on the belt. They're quite often made with a matching belt. However, and this is an important point, and I totally forgot to say it when I was talking about the men's purses, is that after about 1550, purses vanished. No, I did say that. What I didn't say is what happens. What happens is they got pockets. They started wearing breeches with slits in the side seams that went to pockets, and they started keeping all their stuff in pockets instead of in a separate external purse. So that's what happened. And the tailor's manuals from the late 16th century, the breeches patterns in those have pockets in them. So we see that the images disappear from the artistic record, and we also see some evidence from the tailor's manuals that they were making pockets in men's breeches from that point. So if you have a look, I would love to get some images of purses from after 1550. I haven't found any men's purses after 1550, but if anybody has any examples, I'd love to see them.
Oh, wow. Thank you for enlightening me on that.
So I think, again, a lot of this comes from seeing what other people have done and looking at what they're wearing, but it may not be based in evidence. It may be based in assumption. So have a look, see what you can find.
Definitely.
And now I want to talk about a few other things, and then I want to see if there's any questions. So I just wanted to show you just a few physical purses. So here is a little tiny purse, which is a drawstring purse. It's a money purse. And you can see that it's not very big. It has 2 drawstrings, and they close it very nicely. It's not very big, but you can fit a surprising amount in it. And as I mentioned, quite often this purse was then put into another purse. This is a typical flat purse from Central Europe, but this is not the style we're seeing. In this case, the back leather comes over and forms the flap at the front, and then it's sewn across and a hole cut out, and then the belt goes through here. But in Spain, we're not seeing them made this way. We're seeing them made with separate hanging loops, which is interesting. This is a Netherlandish ring pouch, but it works pretty much the same. And the frames for these are actually really easy to find. They're just metal rings which you can buy in craft stalls used for all kinds of things, macrame and various other things. You just need to make sure that you can get your hand into the one that you choose, and then it's very easy to make the purse. The other thing is that you'll notice this really distinctive curve on the base here. That's not a difficult thing to pattern. This purse has stayed in that shape for a long time, but in fact, this is just a rectangle. And when you sew it around the ring and then you lie it flat, it naturally forms this shape all by itself. So it's just a rectangle. This again is not a Spanish purse, this is a German purse, and this is one where there's a ring holding the purse, and again, same deal. This one's got pouchlets on, which is very German, but it's really just a rectangle. And then it has a separate ring, which is the lid. And somebody asked a question earlier about the drawstrings and the hanging strings. So you have a hanging string, and that can be sewn into the tops, or it can continue down along the edge. One way that that was done is that you can tablet weave over the edge of the purse and then turn using a needle and thread as your weft in a circular motion going through. And then when you get to here, you keep doing it. So you're making a tubular tablet weaving. And then when you get to the other end, you just continue down the other side. There are extant examples where we can clearly see that that's also how the outer and the lining have been joined together, is with a four card tablet woven edge around the top, which would strengthen and hold the lining in. Another thing that's really interesting about these purses is even in the ones that are made of really rich textiles like the fabulous brocaded silks, the purse strings, which are usually finger loop braided, the holes are very rarely finished. They're just, you just take the finger loop braid and you put it on a big needle and you just run it in and out of the fabric. As I said, even the really rich textiles, that seems to be how they're mostly done. Let me check the chat. So the pockets were actually part of the garments. Yes. Well, male pockets were part of the garments, not a separate item tied on the waist. The women's pockets were a separate item, and they were tied on over the undergarments, but there was a slit in the outer garment that meant that you could get to them. Getting access to your purse when you're a woman is a really important thing, and that's why they had the really, really long, in the earlier times, the really, really long cords, is that they were often worn under the outer layer of the garment, and you'd have to reach under that and pick it up to get access to your purse. I also know from my own experience that if you're wearing long hanging strings, you want it below your knee, not on your knee. That's the worst place. And the two layers of fabric, the underskirt and the outer skirt, keep it from moving around. So it's actually very comfortable. Okay, what else did I want to show you? Leather. If you're thinking of leather, it doesn't need to be stiff leather. This kind of stiff leather is used for making the men's flat belt pouches, but it's actually not very thick, maybe 1.5 mil, certainly no more than 2. But there are also very soft garment leathers. So leather does not need to be hard, and I think many of the purses that we're seeing are made of a garment leather. The ones that are yellow, I think, are often made of chamois. Chamois is treated with fat, not with tannin, and it stays flexible and soft. It also does not survive in the archaeological context. And if you're going back to the 13th century, you don't need to be a fabulous knitter or weaver. There are some amazing textiles out there. I think this looks like totally a 13th century purse. And this is an Asian silk scarf. Okay, somebody's asked on the text line, can you elaborate a bit on the gussets? Don't have a good example. All right, this purse here is flat. So it's just a single layer which is wrapped over. And with all purses, you can see that it's been sewn and then turned inside out. So the seams are always on the inside, they're never on the outside, and they are absolutely never covered in cross hatches. That's not how they were made. So we have this seam going in, but it's flat. You put stuff in and that makes it go fat. You can see that when you put stuff in for long enough, it just stays flat. But with the gussets, what you've got is an additional strip of leather which has been let in all the way around. So it's sewn in all the way around the edge and the base and back up the other side. And that makes it a fat, square sort of purse. And as I said, seems to be uniquely Spanish. Does that answer your question, whoever was asking about the gussets? Like in a modern handbag. Exactly. Yes, like in a modern handbag. That's what we're seeing. For those men's purses, and again, worn up, you know, like a utility tool belt, although made of nicer materials. Or that style did persist in the lower classes through to the end of the 16th century. I should say that there are 7 pages of notes which go through in enormous detail the styles, when the style was worn, by whom, what sort of class, and so on. So if you want to get into the detail of this, the notes are available for you. Are there any questions? I think I've come to the end of the stuff that I had. Oh, I should say, yes. If you're interested in purses, then there's a great book called Purses in Pieces by Olaf Gubitz. I don't agree with everything he says, but and it's very much Netherlandish based, but he talks a lot about the constructions of purses and frames and has a lot of very interesting general information. I'm sure that I don't need to tell you all about Hispanic costume, which has some good detail and talks about some of the information about what purses were made of, particularly in the upper classes through the records, and a few images. And there are some other generally useful books like Dress Accessories, which talks about purses in London through most of the Middle Ages.
Indeed. And we do have one other question that just popped up, but it got buried under a couple of things. It's how is the cloth attached to the external frame on those later periods?
Well, it depends on the style. So for something like this ring frame, now this is leather, but it works the same. It's simply gathered with a gathering stitch, which goes, it's over the top, and then it's just gathered in and out, and that just holds it onto the frame. And you see the little gathers. With a bar purse, so that was the little bar, and you see the flap of the purse going over the top. There's a hole in the top of the flap, and that is where the swivel comes up, and it was then secured, the flap was secured to itself at the sides, and that keeps it upright. some of the other ones, those purse frames actually have, some of the extant ones actually have little extra bits that come down from them with lots of little holes in it, and you can see that very clearly that was then sewn into the fabric or the leather of the purse to hold it up. And there are other ones where that's pretty much made the same way. So it depends on the style of the frame. With the Ds, again, some of them were clearly over the top. Some other examples show little holes where it was sewn on.
Awesome, awesome. And then another question, what stitch was used to secure the fabric to the lid in that one example that we had where it was like the circle with the flappy lid, I believe?
It just seems to be, well, that was a leather example. For leather, anyway, it just seems to be an overcast stitch. So something very simple. And this is just a gathering stitch. This is just running stitch. But lots and lots of overcasting stitch seems to be the most common. Most of the extant purses that I've had a more detailed look at are from Central Europe, but I don't imagine that the technique would be very different. Somebody's commented about Gusset's shoe book. Yes, absolutely. His shoe book is fabulous too. Okay, somebody said Spain had a silk weaving industry from the 11th century. The patterns are heavily geometric, unlike other silks in Europe, which used animal and figural motifs. Exactly, and that certainly aligns with what I've seen in the artwork depictions and in the extant stuff that we've got, is that it was geometric. It was those beautiful, amazing linear geometric type patterns. We're not seeing images. We're not seeing animals. We're not seeing all of those things, which are really common in the rest of Europe. It's quite a distinctive style. Right, we still have time for some more questions. So if anybody wants to write them in the text line, or I think possibly even turn your mic on. Is that because of the Muslim influence? That's probably a question that somebody else can answer better than I can, but it has always seemed to me to be a logical thing that they did not like the depiction of images and therefore went for geometric designs. Yes, somebody else has said yes, absolutely, yeah. Finger loop braiding, really worthwhile learning how to do. You can make cords for a purse like this. I did those in a fairly fine cord, and I think to make the pair of them probably took me less than 20 minutes. And they're really hard wearing. And we see them all over Europe, including Spain. That's it. Everybody knows everything about purses or is completely stunned by the amount of information I have just poured in through you. Oh, I've got a few things. Could I define Central Europe? Okay. Sorry, I'm using that as a general thing to say France, Germany, Italy, Netherlands, basically the other England, the other countries which are Western and Central Europe, not Southern Europe. There are some, you occasionally get some Italian things that are similar to Spain, but mostly Spain is its own very special thing. In the earlier stages particularly, by the time you're getting into the 16th century, Spain is being the influencer of costume design all over Europe. And so you see Spanish fashions coming through to everywhere else. So initially very different, gradually became more similar.